dawn breaks over feudal Japan. The morning mist parts to reveal two figures standing motionless on opposite ends of a small island. One clutches a wooden sword, seemingly crude and unrefined. The other wields a blade so long it seems to touch the heavens itself. This is not just another sword fight, this is Ganryujima, the stage for what would become the most legendary duel in samurai history. You might think you know about samurai from movies or video games. Perhaps you've seen the elegant katana wielded in countless action sequences or heard tales of honor and bushido. But the real story of these master swordsmen runs deeper than any Hollywood production could capture. Their duels weren't just tests of skill. They were moments that would forge the very soul of Japanese martial arts. Picture this. In an age before guns dominated warfare, when the sword was considered the soul of the warrior, three epic confrontations would forever change the way of the sword. These weren't just fights, they were philosophical battles, clashes of ideology, and moments of transcendent revelation that would echo through centuries. The year is 1612, and the first of our three legendary duels is about to unfold. Miyamoto Musashi, a rising star in the martial arts world, has just arrived at Ganryujima, a small island between Honshu and Kyushu. He's come to face Sasaki Kojiro, a master swordsman known as the Demon of the Western Provinces. But Musashi is late, deliberately late. You see, Musashi understood something that modern mixed martial artists would recognize instantly. Psychological warfare is just as important as physical combat. By arriving hours after the agreed-upon time, he had already begun to unravel his opponent's composure. But what makes this duel particularly fascinating for our American viewers is its striking parallel to the strategic thinking that would later define some of history's greatest military minds. From George Washington's guerrilla tactics to General Patton's psychological operations. Musashi wasn't just fighting with his sword, he was fighting with his mind. As Kojiro waited on that misty shore, his legendary Nodachi sword, named Drying Pole for its extraordinary length, gleamed in the morning sun. This blade was no mere weapon. It was a masterpiece of engineering that would make modern sword enthusiasts weep with joy. At over 3 feet long, it was the equivalent of bringing a greatsword to what most expected to be a katana fight. When Musashi finally arrived, he did something that would have made headlines in any era. He showed up with a wooden sword he had carved from an oar on his way to the island. Imagine stepping into the ring with Muhammad Ali while wearing sandals. That's the level of audacity we're talking about here. But here's where the story takes a turn that would make any modern martial arts instructor lean forward in their chair. Musashi's wooden sword wasn't just a statement. It was a carefully calculated choice. You see, while a steel blade has to be drawn from its scabbard, a wooden sword can be wielded instantly. In the world of sword fighting, where battles are often decided in the blink of an eye, this seemingly crude weapon actually gave Musashi a split-second advantage. The tension on that island must have been electric. Kojiro, the master of the lightning-fast swallow cut, a technique so precise it could supposedly strike a bird in mid-flight, faced off against Musashi, who appeared to have brought a stick to a sword fight. But looks can be deceiving, and this is where our tale really begins to challenge everything you thought you knew about samurai combat. To truly appreciate what happened next, you need to understand that samurai duels weren't just about who could swing a sword harder or faster. They were chess matches played at the speed of thought, where every movement, every breath could telegraph your next move to a skilled opponent. These men had trained their entire lives to read the smallest muscle twitch, to anticipate attacks before they began. As the sun continued to rise over Ganryujima, casting long shadows across the beach, these two masters of the sword began their deadly dance. What happened in the next few moments would be studied, debated, and retold for the next 4 centuries. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, but not for the reasons you might expect. As Kojiro saw Musashi's wooden sword, he did something that would make perfect sense to any fighter. He laughed. "Do you think you can defeat my drying pole with that stick?" he called out. But Musashi remained silent, his face an unreadable mask. Here's where things get interesting for our modern audience. Musashi was playing what we'd now call a psychological game that any UFC fan would recognize. By maintaining his composure while his opponent grew increasingly frustrated, he was setting up for what combat sports analysts today call forcing errors. The duel itself lasted mere seconds, but those seconds changed the course of Japanese martial arts forever. As Kojiro drew his famous nodachi in his signature overhead strike, the devastating swallow cut that had ended so many lives, Musashi made his move. But it wasn't the move anyone expected. Instead of attempting to block or dodge the incoming strike, Musashi did something that perfectly encapsulates why this duel is still studied today. He struck first, and he struck up. The wooden sword, being lighter than steel, moved just a fraction of a second faster than Kojiro's blade. It caught Kojiro square in the forehead, exactly where Musashi had planned. Think about that for a moment. In an age of steel swords and complex techniques, Musashi won using what was essentially a wooden club and basic physics. It's like winning a modern boxing match with nothing but a perfectly timed jab. Simple, effective, and absolutely brilliant. But this brings us to our second legendary duel, one that took place decades earlier and helped shape the very philosophy that Musashi would later embody. This was the confrontation between Yagyu Munenori and Kamizumi Nobutsuna, a battle that was less about physical combat and more about the soul of swordsmanship itself. Yagyu Munenori was no ordinary samurai. Think of him as the equivalent of a modern-day special forces trainer who also happens to be a philosophical genius. He would later become the sword instructor to 3 successive Tokugawa shoguns. Imagine being the personal combat trainer to 3 consecutive U.S. presidents, and you'll get the idea of his influence. Kamizumi Nobutsuna, his opponent, was the founder of the Shinkage Ryu school of swordsmanship, which emphasized mental discipline over physical technique. In modern terms, it would be like Miyamoto Musashi facing off against Bruce Lee. 2 completely different approaches to martial arts philosophy meeting in one crucial moment. Their duel took place at Kamizumi's dojo, but unlike the brutal confrontation on Ganryujima, this was a test of principles. They used wooden training swords wrapped in leather. Think of them as the medieval Japanese equivalent of modern practice weapons. But don't let that fool you into thinking this was any less serious than Musashi's duel. The atmosphere in that dojo must have been intense. Imagine being in the room where 2 grandmasters of chess are about to play the game of their lives, except these men were playing with wooden swords and their reputations as warriors hung in the balance. What makes this duel particularly fascinating for our modern viewers is how it parallels contemporary debates about traditional martial arts versus modern combat sports. Yagyu represented a more practical, results-oriented approach, while Kamizumi emphasized the spiritual and philosophical aspects of swordsmanship. As they faced each other across the dojo floor, the assembled students could hardly breathe. These men were about to demonstrate not just their skill with a sword, but their entire understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. The tension must have been like the moments before a championship fight, when 2 undefeated champions finally meet. The duel between Yagyu and Kamizumi began with a moment of absolute stillness. In modern martial arts, we often talk about the importance of reading your opponent, but these masters took it to another level entirely. They weren't just reading physical cues. They were reading each other's spirit, their intent, their very essence. What happened next would challenge everything we think we know about samurai combat. Instead of the explosive clash everyone expected, Yagyu did something unprecedented. He lowered his sword and stepped slightly to the side. This wasn't a defensive move. It was a philosophical statement made physical. You see, Yagyu had realized something that would later become a cornerstone of modern combat theory. The best way to win a fight is often to avoid it entirely. In that moment, he demonstrated what we now call tactical repositioning, but with a spiritual twist that would have made Sun Tzu proud. Kamiyazumi, recognizing the profound wisdom in this simple movement, responded not with an attack, but with a bow. The duel was over before it had truly begun, but its impact would echo through centuries of martial arts philosophy. Think of it as the samurai equivalent of the famous 1972 Fischer-Spassky chess match, a moment where two different schools of thought collided and created something entirely new. This brings us to our third and perhaps most dramatic duel, featuring Ito Itosai, the founder of the one-sword school. Now, if Musashi was the Muhammad Ali of samurai, bold, unorthodox, and supremely confident, then Itosai was more like Mike Tyson in his prime. Direct, devastatingly effective, and somewhat mysterious. Itosai's story begins with a duel that would make any modern action movie seem tame by comparison. As a young man, he found himself challenged by a master swordsman at the Katori Shrine, one of Japan's most sacred martial arts sites. Picture the intensity of a championship bout at Madison Square Garden, but with deadly steel instead of gloves. The interesting part for our American viewers is how this duel parallels what we now know about the psychology of combat. Modern special forces operators often talk about the concept of getting off the X, moving from the point of danger. Itosai understood this concept centuries ago, but with a deadly twist. As his opponent moved to attack, Itosai did something that would become his trademark. He executed a single, perfect cut. No fancy footwork, no elaborate technique. Just one devastating strike that ended the fight instantly. This is where his school got its name, Ito Ryu, the one-sword school. But here's what makes this duel particularly fascinating. Itosai's approach was revolutionary for its time. In an era when most sword schools were teaching elaborate sequences of moves, he stripped everything down to its bare essentials. It's like comparing a complex Brazilian jiu-jitsu sequence to a simple, devastating knockout punch. The duel itself became legendary not just for its outcome, but for what it represented. In those few seconds, Itosai demonstrated that ultimate mastery isn't about knowing 1,000 techniques. It's about perfecting one technique 1,000 times. This philosophy would later influence everything from modern military close combat training to martial arts movies. The aftermath of this duel changed the landscape of Japanese martial arts forever. Itosai's one-sword school became famous for its directness and efficiency, attracting students who wanted to cut through the philosophical complexity and focus on pure effectiveness. It was the medieval Japanese equivalent of Bruce Lee's famous advice: "I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times." What's particularly fascinating about Itosai's duel at the Katori Shrine is how it revolutionized the way Japanese warriors thought about combat training. Imagine being in a world where everyone believed that more was better, more techniques, more practice forms, more complexity. Then someone comes along and says, no, what you need is less. It's like when Apple introduced the first iPhone with just one button, while other phones were adding more and more keys. The witnesses to Itosai's duel reported something remarkable. The entire encounter lasted less time than it takes to blink. Modern neuroscience has shown that a human blink takes about 300 to 400 milliseconds. In that fraction of a second, Itosai had demonstrated a principle that would later become central to modern combat training: simplicity under pressure. But let's step back for a moment and look at how these three duels, Musashi versus Kojiro, Yagyu versus Kamizumi, and Itosai's revelation at Katori, form a fascinating pattern that still influences martial arts today. Each represents a different approach to the fundamental question: what makes a warrior truly effective? Musashi's duel showed us that winning isn't about having the best equipment. It's about having the best strategy. Think about how the U.S. military special forces often train with minimal equipment to maximize adaptability. Musashi was doing the same thing with his wooden sword, centuries ahead of his time. Yagyu and Kamiizumi's encounter demonstrated that sometimes the greatest victory comes from not fighting at all. This philosophy would later influence everything from modern conflict resolution to corporate negotiation strategies. It's like a high-stakes poker game where the best player knows when to fold. And Ito-sai, his approach was perhaps the most modern of all. In today's world of information overload, his message of mastering one thing perfectly rather than many things partially resonates more than ever. It's the same principle behind the famous 10,000-hour rule of mastery that modern experts talk about. What's particularly interesting for our American viewers is how these duels parallel modern military doctrine. The U.S. Marine Corps has a saying, "Simple, done savagely well." This could have been Ito-sai's motto centuries ago. The Navy SEALs emphasize mental toughness over physical strength, just as Yagyu did. And Musashi's adaptability? That's straight out of the modern special operations playbook. But perhaps the most relevant lesson from these duels for today's audience is about innovation. Each of these masters broke with tradition in some way. Musashi used a wooden sword when everyone else used steel. Yagyu found victory in non-engagement when others sought direct conflict. Ito-sai stripped away complexity when the trend was toward elaboration. These weren't just sword fights. They were moments of disruption, as significant in their time as any modern technological breakthrough. They changed not just how people fought, but how they thought about fighting, about learning, about mastery itself. The ripple effects of these duels spread far beyond the world of martial arts. The principles demonstrated in these encounters influenced Japanese business philosophy, political strategy, and even modern psychology. When we talk about cutting through the noise to find a simple solution, we're unknowingly channeling Ito-sai's spirit. Now you might be wondering, why do these centuries-old duels matter to us today? The answer lies in how these encounters fundamentally change the way people think about conflict, strategy, and mastery, concepts that are more relevant than ever in our modern world. Consider how Musashi's victory on Ganryujima Island parallels modern competitive strategy. When Apple decided to remove the headphone jack from the iPhone, they were, in essence, pulling a Musashi, deliberately handicapping themselves in a way that actually gave them an advantage. Just as Musashi's wooden sword seemed like a weakness, but proved to be a strength, Apple's limitation pushed the industry toward wireless audio. The philosophical depth of Yagyu and Kamiizumi's duel finds its echo in modern leadership principles. Think about how tech giants like Google encourage their employees to spend 20% of their time on personal projects. This apparent non-engagement with immediate business needs often leads to breakthrough innovations, just as Yagyu's seeming non-engagement led to deeper insights about combat. And Ito-sai's one-sword principle? You can see it reflected in companies like In-N-Out Burger, which maintains a deliberately limited menu while competitors constantly add items. It's there in the minimalist design philosophy of Jony Ive's Apple products. It's present in the one-thing principle that successful people from Warren Buffett to Bruce Lee have championed. But these duels offer us something even more profound than business lessons. They show us how innovation often comes from challenging conventional wisdom. When Musashi showed up late to his duel, he was breaking every rule of samurai etiquette. But in doing so, he was also rewriting the rules of psychological warfare. Think about what that means in today's context. When Elon Musk announced he was building reusable rockets, traditional aerospace companies scoffed, just as Kojiro probably scoffed at Musashi's wooden sword. When Netflix decided to stream content online instead of mailing DVDs, it was as radical a departure from convention as Ito-sai's one-strike philosophy. The physical techniques these masters developed might seem less relevant in our digital age, but their mental approaches are more valuable than ever. Musashi's ability to read his opponent's psychology, Yagyu's understanding of strategic positioning, and Itosai's commitment to simplicity. These are the same skills that define success in fields from business to sports to military strategy. Consider how modern special operations units train. They don't just learn hand-to-hand combat. They study psychology, strategy, and decision-making under pressure. They know, as these samurai knew, that the physical aspect of conflict is often the least important part. Each of these duels also teaches us something about innovation cycles. Musashi's wooden sword wasn't just a tactical choice. It was a disruption of the entire samurai weapon paradigm. Yagyu's philosophical approach didn't just win him one duel. It created a new school of martial arts thought. Itosai's one-strike principle didn't just win battles. It revolutionized how people thought about skill mastery. In our modern world, where disruption is a buzzword and innovation is currency, these lessons are invaluable. Just as these masters found ways to transcend the limitations of their time, today's innovators must find ways to break through conventional thinking. The legacy of these three legendary duels extends far beyond the realm of martial arts. They represent watershed moments in human understanding of conflict, strategy, and personal development. But perhaps their most important lesson is one that's particularly relevant to our modern age. True innovation often comes from understanding traditional wisdom deeply enough to know exactly how and when to break from it. Think about how these three different approaches to combat still influence us today. Musashi's psychological warfare and strategic thinking are studied at business schools. Yagyu's philosophical insights about non-engagement inform modern conflict resolution techniques. Itosai's principle of refined simplicity guides everything from product design to military doctrine. But there's something else these duels teach us, something that resonates deeply with modern American values: the power of individual innovation. Each of these masters found their own path, challenged conventional wisdom, and changed their world. Musashi didn't just win a duel. He showed that superior strategy could overcome superior equipment. Yagyu didn't just master swordsmanship. He revealed how mental mastery could transcend physical conflict. Itosai didn't just develop a new technique. He demonstrated how simplicity could triumph over complexity. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're case studies in human potential. When we look at modern innovators like Jeff Bezos, who revolutionized retail with Amazon's one-click ordering, very Itosai-like in its simplicity, or study how elite military units train their operators to think beyond conventional tactics, pure Musashi, we're seeing the same principles at work. The samurai understood something that modern neuroscience is just beginning to confirm. Under pressure, complexity fails. Simple, well-practiced responses work best. This is why Navy SEALs drill basic movements thousands of times, why successful tech companies focus on core products, and why the most effective leaders often have the simplest strategies. What's particularly fascinating is how these ancient duels predicted modern trends in personal development and professional excellence. The idea of deliberate practice that psychologists now promote. Itosai was doing it centuries ago. The concept of strategic empathy that leadership consultants teach. Musashi wrote about it in The Book of Five Rings. The importance of emotional intelligence that modern business schools emphasize. Yagyu was teaching it to his students long before it had a name. As we look to the future, these lessons become even more relevant. In a world of increasing complexity, the ability to find simple, elegant solutions becomes more valuable. In an age of information overload, the capacity to focus on what truly matters, like Itosai with his single perfect cut, becomes essential. In an era of constant disruption, the wisdom to know when to engage and when to step aside, as Yagyu demonstrated, becomes priceless. These three duels, separated by time but united in their impact, remind us that true mastery isn't about collecting techniques or accumulating knowledge. It's about finding your own path, refining it to its essence, and having the courage to stand by your convictions even when they go against conventional wisdom. The way of the sword, as demonstrated by these master samurai, was never just about fighting. It was about understanding yourself, your opponent, and the nature of conflict itself. In today's world, where our battles are more often fought in boardrooms than on battlefields, these insights are more valuable than ever. Thank you for joining us on this journey through 3 of the most influential duels in samurai history. If you've enjoyed exploring these timeless lessons about strategy, innovation, and mastery, please consider subscribing to our channel for more fascinating stories about Japanese history and culture. Hit that like button if you want to see more content about the samurai and their enduring influence on modern life. Don't forget to ring the notification bell to stay updated on our latest uploads. Share this video with anyone you know who's interested in martial arts, strategy, or Japanese history, or anyone who could use some ancient wisdom in their modern life. Until next time, remember what these great masters taught us. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most powerful. The best strategy might be no strategy at all, and true innovation often comes from mastering tradition deeply enough to know exactly how to transcend it. Like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments, which of these 3 duels resonated most with you, and how do you see their principles playing out in your own life? We'll see you in the next video.